delighted to welcome you back as we're coming now to Chapter 2 of Machen's fine little textbook, Introduction to New Testament Greek. By this time, of course, you should have the textbook. I would strongly suggest that you not try to proceed beyond this point until you have the textbook in your hand. The material that I provide for you, of course, online is hopefully going to help you and introduce you to the material, but at the same time, you just really can't have a substitute for reading it and figuring it out and working through the exercises and so on. And so that would be pretty much a prerequisite to our ongoing conversation at this point. But assuming you have the book, you'll notice that the second chapter has to do with accents. Now, I'm just going to tell you, just keep this between us, but you know, there are some people who study the Greek language who kind of ignore accents. And I'm just going to say to you right now, don't do that. The only way to really learn the Greek language is to include all of what the language entails, and that includes accents. If you proceed and sort of treat the accents as unimportant, then you're going to feel as you continue to work with Greek that there's always something going on and you're not quite sure what it is. You're just much better off to bite the bullet and really get a feel for accents early on. So I take accents seriously, and I think you'll find most decent Greek teachers do. And that means that in this lesson and for the next several lessons, I'll keep referring back to what are called the rules of accent, which are introduced in this chapter. Now, I'm just going to tell you up front, this is not going to seem overly exciting. So this is a point to just kind of make sure that you've sort of taken the discipline pill and you're going to just work through this. It'll make a lot more sense, believe me, as you go along, and pretty soon the application of the rules of accent will pretty much become second nature and you won't have to think very hard about it. But right here at the beginning, I'll warn you that many Greek students find this a little bit confusing and even daunting, but don't let it slow you down. You will get it. I'll try to explain it, and I think you'll find that as you proceed along, it'll get a lot easier. But this first chapter that we have with the rules of accent may seem a little bit confusing at the beginning. So I hope I haven't scared you off. I don't mean to, but anyway, that's really what we're going to be doing in this chapter. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and start taking a look at the chapter, and I'll try to introduce and explain the basic ideas that Machen provides for us. We'll have some exercises toward the end that'll let you try out your skills. And then, of course, in the next chapter, Chapter 3, we actually encounter our first set of vocabulary words, and that's when the whole study becomes a little more interesting, I'll tell you that. So for now, let's take a look at this chapter. All right, well, let's take a look now at the first page of this chapter. This is page 13. And just a few things to notice here. He indicates in paragraph 9, the Greek accents indicated in ancient times not stress, or what we call accent, but musical pitch. So if you are a gifted musician, then you might want to try to sing this, but actually we're not going to even make a dim attempt at doing that. And really the long and short of what he says here is when you see a Greek word with an accent mark on it, regardless of whether it's an acute accent, a grave accent, or a circumflex accent, simply accent that syllable and don't worry too much about trying to distinguish among the various accents and try to pronounce each one differently. That's probably way beyond anything we need to be concerned about in this chapter. In paragraph 10, he notes that there are 3 syllables that have special names in Greek. The final syllable is called the ultima. Prior to that is the syllable called the penult, and before that, the syllable called the antepenult. The other syllables don't have a special name, but these 3 syllables, the last 3 of any Greek word, if the Greek word happens to have 3 syllables, 3 or more, then these are the names, the antepenult, the penult, and the ultima. I'll be using those terms fairly commonly, so this is the time to get familiar with them. Here we have a typical Greek word. This is the word, can you say that? I'll give you a chance to try it out. Lambonomen, lambonomen. Lambda, alpha, mu, lam, beta, alpha, ba, and then O is the omicron, men. Lambonomen. If you're interested, it means we take or we receive. But notably, you'll see it has 4 syllables. Lam, ba, no, men. The ultima is the word men, or the syllable men. The penult is no, and the antepenult is ba. Do you see that? Lam, ba, no, men. Now he notes here that syllables containing a long vowel, you remember the long vowels, don't you? Omega would be one, a long alpha would be one, eta is one, or a diphthong, so diphthongs are always long. Long vowels are obviously long, and so he says syllables containing either a long vowel or a diphthong are, not surprisingly, long. But a couple of exceptions. Greek is like any language, a language with exceptions. And here's the first exception you're going to run into. If you find a final alpha iota or a final omicron iota, the last two letters, you see, of a word, alpha iota or omicron iota, then they will be short. So I and oi coming at the very end of a word are going to be short. All other diphthongs are long. So we take a look here at this particular word, anthropous. Anthropous. Do you see that? And the last syllable, the ultima, is long because it contains the diphthong omicron upsilon. The last syllable, however, of anthropoi, omicron iota, is short because here omicron iota is short if it's the last two syllables or last two letters of a word. But notice similarly we have anthropois. This is long because the sigma comes later, and so we don't have omicron iota as the last two letters. So just commit that to memory. We have alpha iota and omicron iota are short if they come last in a word, otherwise they're going to be long. He continues, it'll be remembered that epsilon and omicron are always short, and eta and omega are always long. The quantity, long or short, of alpha, and, continuing on the next page, of iota and upsilon must be learned by observation in the individual cases, because you'll recall that those letters can be either long or short, and you'll just simply have to learn them for each word as we go along, which, by the way, is not as difficult as it may sound at the beginning. All right, let's continue now. This is the most important part of this chapter, really. This is the general rules of accent. So I'm going to go through these fairly carefully and try to be sure to read it and listen to my explanation, and hopefully if you'll get these nailed down fairly early, then it'll help you in your ongoing treatment of accents and your ongoing studies of the Greek language. So we have three accents. You already know this. We saw this in the last chapter. We have the acute accent, we have the grave accent, and we have the circumflex accent. Notice what he says, the acute accent can stand on one of the last three syllables. Circumflex can only stand on one of the last two syllables. The grave is only going to show up on the last syllable. So that's the first rule, pretty easy. Acute, last three, circumflex, last two, grave, last one. So for example, he gives this particular illustration. Here we have the word apostolos. It means apostle. Apostolos. Notice it's 4 syllables long, and here we see we have an acute accent on the 4th syllable from the back of the word. Well, that violates the rule, and so as he indicates, we can't let that one fly because it's violating that rule. Similarly, we have here the word pisteuomen. It means we believe, but it's been misaccented because there we have a circumflex, but the circumflex is on the antepenult. It's 3 syllables from the back of the word, and we know, of course, that a circumflex must land on the last two, one of the last 2 syllables. So hopefully that makes sense. It's pretty straightforward. The second rule, the circumflex cannot stand on a short syllable. Straightforward. A circumflex will always be on a long syllable, so just keep that in mind. Now here it gets a little trickier, but just keep your eye on the details. If the ultima is long, so if you have a word and the last syllable of that word is long, then the antepenult cannot be accented. I'm going to tell you there is one little exception to that, but we don't get to it until about chapter 20 of the book, so for now don't worry about it. But the basic rule to keep in mind is that when the antepenult or when the ultima is long, you cannot accent the third syllable from the back of the word. And if the penult is accented at all, it must have the acute. When I was learning Greek many years ago, my Greek professor had a little acronym that he used to help us illustrate this, and it was lilac pen. Lilac pen. I don't know if I can write that out for you here. I'll give it a try. Lilac pen. All right. Last is long, acute on the penult. Does that make sense? If the ultima is long, if the last is long, then if the penult is accented, this is not saying it necessarily will be accented, but if it is accented, then it must have the acute accent. It cannot have the circumflex. So rule 3, lilac pen. If the last is long, acute on the penult, if in fact the penult is being accented. So for example, he says that rule would be violated if we were looking at this, for example. This is apostolo. You'll notice here that first of all, we have a long ultima, so we cannot actually have an accent way back here on the antepenult, because if the last is long, then we must accent either the penult or the ultima. The rule would be violated similarly here when we have apostolou. Notice that the last syllable is long, and if the last syllable is long, then we cannot accent the antepenult. That's part A that we're looking at. And it would not be violated, however, in this case, apostole, because the epsilon is short, and so we are permitted to put an accent on the antepenult. Similarly, omicron iota is short, so we're permitted to put an accent on the antepenult. This is not telling you exactly how the word will be accented, but it is indicating how it may not be accented. 3b, the second part of this rule, would be violated by, for example, doulou, because notice here we have a long ultima, and if the last is long, then it takes an acute on the penult if the penult is accented, but it cannot have a circumflex. Similarly here, if we have doulon, well, we know that the omicron or the omega nu is long, and so we'd have to have an acute here. Lilac pen, last is long, acute on the penult. Here we're okay, because doulos, that omicron is short. If we have a circumflex on the penult here, then that's all right. Similarly here, or if you have a short ultima, omicron iota, then again you're permitted to put a circumflex there on the penult. All right, now the next rule is related to it, just a little bit of a different flavor of it. If the ultima is short, he says, then a long penult, if it is accented at all, must have the circumflex. We just saw an example right here of that very thing. I'm sorry, we had an example right here of that very thing. We have doulos, the last is short. Then right here we have a long accented penult, so it takes the circumflex. Here we have a short ultima, a long accented penult takes the circumflex. This is the very thing we're dealing with in this rule. Here we find a violation of the rule. The last is short here. Here's a long penult, so it should have the circumflex, you see, not the acute. Similarly here, we have a short ultima, so we should have here a circumflex. It would not be violated by doulou, because in this case, the last syllable is long, and lilac pen dictates that if the last is long, we will have an acute on the penult if it is accented. This we have huios, the word for sun. The short ultima would dictate that if we had a accent on the penult, then it would be a circumflex. But notice the rule is not dictating that the penult must be accented. It's simply saying that if it is accented, then it must take the circumflex. In this case, it turns out that the ultima is accented, huios, and therefore there's no violation of the rule here. Okay, now that's the trickiest part, and that may just take a little bit of thinking and reflecting, but I think you'll find that as you just work it through, it'll begin to make a little bit of sense as we go along. The fifth rule says a long ultima can have either the acute or the circumflex. The long ultima, the last syllable of the word, may have an acute, may have a circumflex. You're simply going to learn on a case-by-case basis how these particular words are accented. Continuing that thought here, of course, we have the word adelphou. Adelphou. You notice we have a circumflex on the long ultima, and that is perfectly permissible, but under the rules of accent, this would be permissible too, an acute. They both conform to the rules of accent. As a matter of fact, this one happens to be correct, but you won't know that until you actually learn this word, which will take place in chapter 4. So right now all we're saying is this is telling us ways we may not accent a word. It's not necessarily telling us in all cases how we will accent the word. Finally, the last rule, which is pretty simple, an acute accent on the last syllable of a word is changed to a grave when it's followed without any intervening punctuation, a comma or a period, by other words in the sentence. So it's simply saying that adelphos is right if it stands alone, but if adelphos is followed by apostolou, you see right here, then we're going to change that acute there to a grave. And so that's the way it would look right there. As I've mentioned to you a couple of times, you'll notice that these rules of accent do not tell what the accenting of any individual word is to be. It only tells what it cannot be, and that's the important thing. It's telling you what you may not do, not necessarily in every case telling you what you must do. And so this is defining by negation, as it were. We look at a variety of words, and we might determine under the rules that there are several different ways that a word might be accented. And so the discussion that he gives you down here at the bottom is intended to illustrate that point. There are a variety of ways that you might accent a word, none of which would violate the rules of accent. As it turns out, only one is going to be correct, but you'll have to know some other things in order to reach that conclusion. And we're helped out in that regard by the rule of verb accent, which is introduced here at paragraph 13. He says that verbs have the recessive rule. This rule means that in verbs, the accent goes as far back, meaning as far toward the beginning of the word, as the general rules of accent will permit. This rule will definitely fix the accent of any verb form. So when you're dealing with a verb, you will be able to tell virtually in every case how that word is to be accented, because the accent wants to go as far to the beginning of the word or toward the beginning of the word as it possibly can. He gives an illustration here just to show by example how this works. Here we have, for example, a verb. All right? It's the word egenoskou, egenoskou. I'm wondering how to accent it. Well, the first thing I notice is that in this word, the ultima is long. Omicron, upsilon is a diphthong, and it's long. So I say to myself, okay, what do the rules of accent say? They say that if the last is long, I cannot accent the antepenult. Remember that? If the last is long, the accent has to go either on the penult or the ultima. Because the accent wants to go as far back as possible, I know that it cannot go here, it has to be here. Then I remember lilac pen. Last is long, it's going to take an acute on the penult. And so the correct accent for this word will be egenoskou, which is the way that he actually concludes down here somewhere, there it is right there, that would be the correct accenting of that word. That's the kind of reasoning you do with a verb. You notice the ultima, and then you ask yourself, if the ultima is long, you know you're going to have to stay on the last two syllables for the accent. If it's short, you can go back to the third accent, the antepenult, and really pretty much straightforward from there. Down here, for example, I'm going to notice here's another verb. This is egenoske. It ends in an epsilon. Epsilon is short, so I know that the accent can actually go all the way back, you see, to the antepenult. So I know that that can't be correct, that circumflex there. It's going to be here on the antepenult, and I also know that if the antepenult is accented, it has to have the acute. It cannot have the circumflex, it cannot have the grave, and so I'm going to reach the conclusion that this egenoske is correct with an acute on the antepenult. Hope that makes sense. That's the idea. So verbs, with the rules of accent and with the special rule that applies to verbs, namely the recessive accent, you should, as a rule, always be able to determine what the accent is actually going to be. When we come to the nouns, however, it's a little bit more difficult. Nouns, he tells us, involve accents remaining on the same syllable as in the nominative singular. Now, I know that unless you've studied a inflected language like Latin, for example, you may not be overly familiar with the word declension or even nominative singular, and all I can do at this point is just ask you to be patient. The nouns will be presented to you in the vocabulary list in what's called the nominative singular. And in the nominative singular, you will see an accent, and that's what we're talking about. It's the way you find the accent in the, as it were, vocabulary form of the word. So what he's saying is the accent wants to remain on the same syllable where you found it in the nominative singular. Sometimes it can stay there, sometimes it cannot. It depends on other matters that we'll certainly be talking about as we go along, but for now you'll just have to take it by faith that as we deal with the word, it may change its spelling slightly, and that may affect how we're going to accent it. He says here this rule differs from the rule of verb accent in that it does not in itself fix the accent of the word. The accent on the nominative singular, the form in the vocabularies, must be learned by observation for every noun separately. And, so just keep it in mind. When you learn a vocabulary word, learn to pronounce it. Say it out loud. Hear yourself say the word correctly with the correct accent. And if you begin to hear it in your mind with the correct accent, it'll help you a lot later as you're trying to deal with the rules of accent. For example, the Greek word apostolos, you see, the word for apostle. Well, there's, several ways you might pronounce it. You might say apostolos or apostolos or apostolos or apostolos, you see. You can accent it a variety of ways. Well, learn it the correct way. Apostolos. Accent on the antepenult. And then later, as you're dealing with the word and the rules of accent, you'll find that it's much easier to figure out how the accent will actually be applied in a given case. To illustrate the point, we come over to page 17 and we see this word. I'm sure you've heard this word before. It's the word logos. It's in the first verse of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Logos. But for now, we just want to notice that when we encounter this word in the vocabulary list, we're going to see that it's accented this way. This is the nominative singular. Theoretically, it could have been accented this way with the accent on the ultima, but it isn't. When we see it in the vocabulary list, we're going to notice that it's accented with an acute on the penult. And once we know that, then as a rule, we're going to be able to determine the accent in the other forms in which the word occurs. Now again, without trying to give a lengthy explanation here, which will certainly come later, I just want to tell you that we're going to see that this word changes its spelling depending on its grammatical usage, and in each case the spelling is going to have something to do with how it's accented. So each one of those you'll see is the same word but spelled slightly differently. And so in each case, as the spelling, as the ending changes, I might see a change in the accent. Now, as it turns out, in the case of logos, there is no change. In each case, we're going to keep the acute, and that's what we want to do. The only reason we would change the accent is if somehow the rules of accent didn't permit us to leave the accent where we found it. So we're going to, for example, here, see that the rules of accent actually are going to change the way in which the word might be accented. Here's the word oikos. It means house. notice it has a circumflex on the penult. All right, well now when I get to oikou, that is a long ultima, and remember lilac pen, it says that if I'm going to accent the penult, it must be an acute. So even though I had a circumflex in the nominative singular, I'm required to change it to an acute because of the rule that we've called lilac pen, last is long, acute on the penult. Similarly here, oiko, last is long, acute on the penult. But then notice here, oikon, omicron is short, so we can go back to our circumflex. Do you see how that works? Again, don't worry about what exactly is happening here. If you're not familiar with, as I say, an inflected language, then we'll learn this soon enough. But just for now, keep in mind that the rule of noun accent, called the retentive rule, wants to retain, to the extent possible, the form of accent that was found in the nominative singular. But there are times when the rules of accent may require that we have to change the accent somewhat. He says here in this one that anthropos is the form in the nominative singular, the vocabulary list. But for example, if this last syllable became long, which indeed it does, anthropou, then this accent, this acute, is going to have to move here to the penult. So it's anthropos, anthropou, anthropo, and then anthropon. So just bear in mind that the length of the ultima may manipulate to some degree the placement of the accent. Please go ahead and read the rest of this. I hope that with my explanation this will make sense. But just to help us get a feel for this, I'd like to do the first few of these exercises. I will in each case do with you in this lecture format the first few exercises and then leave the rest for you. Of course, as you know, the answer key is provided, so you should download the answer key, do the work, test your work, make sure that in each case you're understanding exactly what's going on. But just by way of kind of illustrating the point here, notice he says these are verb forms. All right, well, if it's a verb form, then I know that the recessive rule applies. I'm going to try to move the accent as far back toward the beginning of the word as I can. So here I am. Here's the word eluomen, eluomen. This means we destroy or we loose, either one. What do I notice? I notice that the ultima is short. I know that if the ultima is short, then I am permitted to put an acute on the antepenult, and that is in fact the correct accent. I cannot put a circumflex here because remember, a circumflex cannot stand on the third syllable from the end, on the antepenult, only an acute, so I know definitely that the accenting of this word is eluomen with an acute on the antepenult. Here I've got the word eluomein, and I notice now that that is long. You see how that works? So now I know I cannot accent the antepenult. I know that I have to accent the penult. I say to myself, how shall I accent it? Well, last is long, acute on the penult. So I know this is definitely going to be an acute. I also know it because omicron is short, and a short syllable cannot have the circumflex. It can't be the grave because the grave can only stand on the last syllable. So by process of elimination, I wind up with certainty that this is eluomein with an acute on the penult. Similar reasoning goes here. Eluso, the future form. Omega is long, so I know that last is long. It'll be an acute on the penult. Eluso. How about here? Eluu. Well, the last syllable is long, and so I know that I'm going to have an acute on the penult. Here, however, I notice that the last syllable is short, and so my acute is going to go back to the antepenult. Here, elusamein, this is long, so it's got to be here. You see, it's really pretty straightforward once you get a feel for doing it. I'll do these rather rapidly, and you can check your work later, but didaska, short, therefore acute on the antepenult. Sorry, my drawing isn't perfect there, but that's the idea. didascontai, that's short. Remember, a final alpha iota is short, so the accent's going to go back here on the antepenult. Here, didascomatha, that is a short alpha, and so once again the accent is going to go here on the antepenult. He tells you the accent, the alpha is short, because of course in some cases alpha can be long, but if you know it's short, then you know how that will go. Go ahead and work through the rest of those. Let's take a look at the other type of exercise here. This last set of exercises deals with nouns, so that's the difference. Now we have nouns, and notice he tells you the nominative singular. For example, in this first word, apostolos, apostle, is with an acute on the antepenult. So let's go ahead and work through that. This first series, number 1, all deals with apostolos. So I'll give you this much, and you can go ahead and work it through from there. I know that if the acute is on the antepenult, that's where I want to leave it. So I come to apostolos, and I say, is it possible to put the accent there? Well, let's see. Oops, look at that. The last syllable is long. Final omicron iota is long, so I cannot put it here. The accent, therefore, is going to be brought to the penult. Last is long, acute on the penult. No accent here, because if you have a long ultima, you're not permitted to put an accent on the antepenult. Exactly the same reasoning as here. Omicron upsilon is long, so we wind up with an acute there. Same reasoning here. Apostolou, lu is long, so we have an acute right there. Now I come here, apostoloi, and I go, oh, look at that. That is omicron iota. Omicron iota is short, so I can move the accent back where I found it in the nominative singular on the antepenult. Here we have apostolo, and of course the omega is long, so once again it's going to wind up here on the penult. Does that make sense how that's working? I think if you think that through a little bit, you're going to find that it's not overly difficult, but it does take a little brain application right here at the beginning, so I hope that's helpful to you. Again, do the exercises, check your work, and hopefully that will be useful to you. The final set of exercises simply asks, are the following words accented correctly so far as the general rules of accent are concerned? So I'm going to ask myself here, a didomen. Well, that's not right, because I know I cannot have an accent on the fourth syllable vac. So we got a problem there. Here I've got horai. Well, that can't be right, because remember, if the ultima is short, then a long accented penult must have the circumflex. Here I've got prophates. Well, this is a problem because the last syllable is long. Remember, alpha iota is only short if it is the last two letters. But here we have a sigma, so that makes it long, so I cannot have an accent on the antepenult. It would have to go here on the penult. I hope that makes sense. That's the idea. If you just think that through, do the exercises, I think you'll find that these are not as difficult as they may seem at the beginning, but hopefully that'll get you started. Well, I hope those explanations helped and made sense to you. You might want to just go back and listen again if anything seemed a little bit confusing. But really, the best way to approach this is now do the exercises, read and reread the chapter till you're pretty comfortable with those rules of accent. I think you'll find that as you keep working with them, they'll become increasingly easy as you go along. So that's your task now for this first chapter. I really appreciate having you come along so far, and next chapter we're going to start introducing some vocabulary words. That always makes this entire exercise somewhat more interesting. Again, my strong encouragement is don't skip by this chapter too quickly. Make sure you really have a comfort level with these rules of accent. I'll keep reminding you of them for the next several chapters. We'll keep bumping into these rules of accent, and even the exercises that I provide for you. I think you'll find that you're given an opportunity to rethink those rules as you go along. If you do this with a certain degree of scrupulousness now, you're going to find that by the time you get to chapter 4 or 5, it'll be pretty much pro forma, and you won't be having to exercise too much anxiety over the whole thing by then. It's been a pleasure to have you with us, and hopefully this will be a good and enjoyable set of studies for you, and I'll just welcome you back the next time that you're ready to go to chapter 3. And until then, God's richest blessing on your studies of the Greek language.